She was invisible. To the high-powered executives at the Golden Terrace, she was just a uniform carrying a tray. But when a Korean billionaire reached his breaking point over a mysterious company collapse, this waitress did something that left him speechless and changed the fate of a global empire. You need to hear this. Welcome to this channel where you listen to exciting and intriguing storytelling. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and tell us, where are you watching from today? You know, sometimes the person with the answers is the one we never think to ask. That was the world Naomi Grant lived in. Every day at the Golden Terrace in downtown Chicago, she served people who spent more on a single lunch than she earned in a month. But Naomi wasn't supposed to be there. 3 years ago, her life was a whirlwind of complex data and market trends. She had been a rising star in business analytics, finishing research papers that veterans in the field struggled to decode. She had a future that was almost too bright to imagine. But then life changed her plans. Medical bills for her family began to pile up like snowdrifts, and Naomi had to pack her degree away in a box she couldn't bear to open. Now she carried tea and smiled through an aching heart, wondering if her voice would ever matter again. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the energy in the restaurant shifted. Choi Sung-min walked in. He was the kind of powerful that made other executives straighten their ties. Once a titan of the tech world, his company was now in a mystery collapse, and the desperation in his eyes was clear as he stared at the falling revenue graphs on his tablet. He sat in a quiet corner, a man who had accepted defeat from every consultant in the city. He didn't see Naomi approaching with his tea, he only saw the end of his legacy. He had no idea that the woman standing before him was about to see the one pattern everyone else had missed. The Golden Terrace was always at its most frantic during the final hour of the lunch rush. The air was a heavy blend of expensive cologne, searing steak, and the sharp rhythmic clinking of silverware that sounded more like a countdown than a meal. For Naomi Grant, the chaos was a familiar shield. She moved through the dining room with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to be a ghost in plain sight, her hands steady as she balanced a heavy tray of porcelain and crystal. She was a master of the middle distance, never looking too closely at the faces of the elite, and ensuring they never looked too closely at hers. To them, she was simply an extension of the mahogany furniture, efficient, silent, and entirely replaceable. As the noise began to thin into a low, professional hum, Naomi turned her attention to the quietest corner of the restaurant. There, tucked away from the sunlight, sat table 14. It was occupied by a man whose presence seemed to pull the very air out of the room. Choi Sung-min didn't look like the titan of industry the headlines described. He looked like a man drowning in dry land. His dark suit was immaculate, yet he sat with a heavy, hunched exhaustion that no tailor could hide. Naomi approached with a fresh pot of oolong tea, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She noticed immediately that his meal remained untouched. His focus was entirely consumed by a tablet propped against a water glass. On the screen, a series of jagged red lines told a story of ruin, revenue graphs plunging toward zero, marketing costs spiking into the millions, and a customer retention curve that looked like a cliffside. It was the mystery collapse that had been the talk of the financial world for weeks, a puzzle that the most expensive consultants in Seoul and New York had failed to solve. She set the tea down with a soft, metallic click. Usually, this was the moment she would slip away, retreating back into the safety of the kitchen. But as she glanced at the glowing screen, something in her mind clicked into place. It was a reflex she hadn't been able to fully kill, the instinct of a strategist who saw patterns where others saw noise. She saw the expansion timeline overlapping with the surge in customer complaints, a lethal synchronization of hubris and neglect. For 3 years, Naomi had kept her brilliance packed away in a box, hidden behind a polite smile and a waitress's apron. But seeing the data laid out so clearly, so dangerously wrong, made the silence feel like a lie. She hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of her tray. The restaurant was nearly empty now, the stakes of the room reduced to just the two of them. She took a breath, the weight of her hidden past pressing against her chest, and finally broke the unspoken rule of her survival. "The expansion wasn't the problem, sir," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "It was the bridge you burned to get there." Choi Sung-min did not look up, but his hand, which had been reaching for the oolong tea, froze mid-air. The silence at the corner table grew heavy, amplified by the distant, muffled sounds of the kitchen staff beginning their post-rush cleanup. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Golden Terrace, The Chicago skyline stood indifferent to the digital carnage playing out on Choi's screen. To the public, the collapse of his company Nexus V was a sensational headline, a mystery that dominated financial news cycles and sparked endless speculation about market volatility or sabotage. But here, in the shadows of the restaurant, the reality was far less mysterious and far more painful. Nexus V had been more than a tech firm. It had been a decade of Choi's life, built on the principle of deep, intuitive connection with its users. Yet, as the graphs on his tablet indicated, that connection had been severed with surgical precision. The red lines represented more than lost revenue. They represented the thousands of loyal customers who had quietly walked away while Choi was busy celebrating his aggressive expansion into European markets. He had believed the experts who told him that growth was the only metric that mattered. He had listened to the analysts who argued that his original user base was a captured audience that could be neglected in favor of new, shinier demographics. He finally raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and weary, landing on the woman in the crisp white apron who had dared to speak. For a fleeting second he expected to see the face of a critic or a mocking competitor, but instead he found Naomi. Her expression wasn't one of pity or triumph. It was the calm, analytical gaze of someone who had seen this exact catastrophe coming from miles away. The headlines called it an unpredictable market shift, but as Naomi stood there, the weight of her tray balanced perfectly, she looked like she was seeing right through the polished facade of his corporate failure. Choi looked back down at the tablet. 4 months he had been staring at these same numbers, drowning in data provided by the world's most prestigious consulting firms. They had given him 500-page reports filled with jargon and excuses. None of them had mentioned a burned bridge. None of them had looked at the human cost of his ambition. A bridge. Choi's voice was a dry rasp, the first words he had spoken in nearly an hour. He gestured vaguely at the plummeting retention curve. The analysts say it's a global trend. They say the market is cooling. Naomi didn't flinch. She set the tray on a nearby stand, her movements purposeful. The market isn't cooling, Mr. Choi, she replied, her voice dropping to a confidential tone that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. It's just moving on. You treated your foundation like a stepping stone, and now you're realizing the ground beneath you is gone. Choi looked at her, the confusion in his eyes sharpening into a flicker of genuine interest. He pushed the tablet toward the center of the table, the glowing screen acting as a campfire between two people from different worlds. You talk like an architect of systems, not someone who clears tables, he said, his voice dropping an octave. Where did a waitress learn to see the foundation in a revenue report? Naomi's gaze drifted for a moment, her mind traveling back to a version of herself that felt like a character in someone else's book. Long before she had learned to balance 3 heavy plates on one arm, she had balanced the variables of complex market models. She had been a star student in business analytics, a girl who saw the world in elegant equations and predictive patterns. Her professors had called her a prodigy, a natural-born strategist, who could find the heartbeat of a corporation just by listening to its data. She had dreamed of sitting in high-backed leather chairs, advising leaders on how to build empires that lasted for generations. But life has a way of rewriting even the most meticulous plans. Just as she was preparing for her final honors thesis, the phone call came. It wasn't a corporate recruiter. It was her sister. Their mother was sick, and the specialized care she needed wasn't covered by any scholarship Naomi held. In an instant, the high-rise offices were replaced by the fluorescent lights of hospital corridors, and the research papers were replaced by medical invoices that arrived like a relentless tide. Naomi had dropped everything. She flew home, packed her textbooks into a cardboard box, and pushed it deep under her bed. A coffin for a dream she couldn't afford to chase anymore. To pay the mounting bills, she took the only job that offered immediate cash and flexible hours: the Golden Terrace. For 3 years she had worn the black and white uniform like a suit of armor, masking her intelligence with a polite, "Would you like more water, sir?" while her brain secretly calculated the overhead costs and customer turnover of the very restaurant where she served. "I studied business analytics," Naomi said, finally meeting Choi's gaze with a quiet, steely pride. "I was 1 semester away from a degree that told me exactly why a company like yours would fail the moment it stopped valuing its core." She looked back at the tablet, the red lines no longer intimidating her. "I never got to use that degree in a boardroom, Mr. Choi. But data is the same whether you're looking at it from a CEO's chair or from behind a service counter. Choi stared at her, the realization hitting him harder than any financial report ever had. He wasn't just looking at a waitress. He was looking at an expert who had been forced into the shadows. A semester away, he whispered, more to himself than to her. And here I am, surrounded by experts with decades of experience, and not one of them had the courage to tell me I was burning my own house down. Choi Sung-min stared at the cooling cup of oolong tea, the steam no longer rising to meet his weary gaze. 4 months, he had felt like a commander watching his fortress crumble from a distance, unable to find the breach in the walls. The last stand of his career was not happening in a high-tech war room or during a fierce board meeting. It was happening here at a small corner table under the soft glow of a restaurant's ambient lights. He looked at Naomi, really looked at her, seeing for the first time the sharp intelligence behind her service-oriented calm. He slid the tablet across the white tablecloth toward her. It was a gesture of total surrender, a silent admission that the millions he had spent on high-level consultants had bought him nothing but confusion. "Show me," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of desperation and a newfound, fragile hope. "Show me the bridge I burned." Naomi set her tray on an empty chair and stepped closer, the light from the screen reflecting in her eyes. With a steady hand she began to manipulate the data. She didn't use the complex, jargon-heavy overlays his analysts preferred. Instead she stripped the graphs back to their rawest form. She pulled up the timeline of Nexus vs European expansion and overlaid it with the data from their original legacy user base, the people who had been with the company since its garage startup days. "You see this gap?" Naomi asked, pointing to a sharp divergence where the expansion costs spiked and the legacy engagement began to flatline. While your marketing team was spending a fortune to acquire new users in London and Berlin, you were quietly removing the features that made your original customers loyal. You streamlined the interface for a global audience, but in doing so, you gutted the soul of the product for the people who built your foundation. She tapped a folder of ignored customer feedback logs that had been buried 3 layers deep in the system. They weren't leaving because of a market shift, Mr. Choi. They were leaving because they felt abandoned. You traded your community for a demographic. Choi watched as the jagged red lines finally made sense. It wasn't a mystery, it was a betrayal. He had been so focused on the horizon that he had stepped right off the cliff he was standing on. The tablet, once a symbol of his impending ruin, now felt like a map leading back to the truth. He looked up at Naomi, the silence between them filled with the gravity of her revelation. For the first time in a year, the crushing weight in his chest eased, replaced by the clarity of a man who finally knows exactly how he lost his way. The silence at the corner table felt heavy, a physical barrier between the world of elite corporate struggle and the quiet reality of service. Naomi stood at the threshold of her 2 lives, the steam from the forgotten tea curling between her and the man who held a crumbling empire in his hands. For 3 years she had mastered the art of being a shadow, a presence that offered comfort without ever demanding attention. But as she watched Choi's finger hover over a marketing spend that she knew was a death trap, the invisibility she had cultivated began to feel like a cage. She took a half step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that felt deafening in the hushed dining room. This was the moment she was supposed to retreat, to vanish back into the kitchen and leave the billionaire to his ruin. Instead, she let the tray rest against her hip, her gaze fixed not on the man, but on the raw truth of the data before them. "Sir, may I say something?" The words were soft, barely more than a whisper, but they acted like a physical jolt to Choi. He looked up, his brow furrowed as if he were seeing her for the very first time. He was a man used to the loud, confident declarations of vice presidents and board members, not the tentative interruption of a waitress. Yet there was something in Naomi's eyes, a clarity, a lack of fear, that stopped him from dismissing her. He was too exhausted to maintain the walls of his status, and too desperate for a truth that made sense. "You've been looking at these graphs as a series of financial failures," Naomi continued, her voice gaining a steady rhythmic strength. "But these aren't just numbers. They're a conversation your customers are having with you, and right now, you're the only one not listening." She reached out, her finger hovering just inches from the tablet screen, pointing to a sharp drop-off that followed an aggressive expansion year. The first crack in her invisibility had formed, and as Choi watched her, his surprise slowly gave way to a profound, unsettled curiosity. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw a person who was looking at the chaos of his life and seeing a pattern. For the first time since the collapse began, Choi didn't look away. He leaned in, beckoning her to cross the final distance between his world and hers. Naomi reached into the pocket of her crisp white apron and pulled out a spare tablet. Not a high-end digital device like Choi's, but a simple physical notepad used for taking orders. She laid it flat on the mahogany table, clearing away the sugar caddy to create a makeshift workspace. With a pen she usually used to scribble down orders for linguine or sea bass, she began to draw. She didn't draw pictures. She sketched the skeletal structure of an empire in distress. Choi watched, mesmerized, as the waitress transformed his chaotic reality into a series of stark logical lines. On the top of the page she drew a large circle representing his core customer base, the loyalists who had sustained Nexus V for a decade. Then she drew a series of smaller, jagged arrows pointing away from that circle, heading toward a distant, shimmering star labeled Global Expansion. "Your consultants told you that your original customers were stagnant," Naomi said, her voice dropping into the rhythmic cadence of a professional analyst. "They told you that to grow you had to pivot. But look at what happened when you pivoted." She drew a thick, heavy line that cut directly through the connection between the core circle and the product's primary features. "In your rush to simplify the interface for new markets in Europe and Asia, you removed the advanced customization tools that your power users lived for. You didn't just update your software, Mr. Choi. You evicted your most valuable tenants to make room for guests who haven't even checked in yet." She quickly calculated a ratio on the side of the page, the numbers flowing from her pen with practiced ease. "Your cost of customer acquisition for new markets is 6 times higher than the cost of retaining your old ones. While you were spending millions on billboards in London, your original users were flooding your support forums with a single unified complaint: you don't listen to us anymore." She overlaid the timeline of his aggressive expansion with a secondary graph of customer service wait times and bug reports. The mystery collapse suddenly wasn't a mystery at all. It was a visible chain reaction. The more he chased the new, the more he poisoned the old. The silence at the table was profound as Choi looked at the napkin. The chaos that had kept him awake for months, the market volatility his board had blamed, was laid bare as a series of deliberate, overlooked decisions. "You chased the horizon and forgot to check the foundation," Naomi concluded, setting the pen down. The simple chart on the cheap paper held more truth than the glossy 100-page reports stacked in his office. For the first time in a year, Choi wasn't looking at a sea of red ink. He was looking at a map. He looked at Naomi, his mouth slowly falling open as the sheer clarity of her genius hit him. She had decoded the death of his legacy on a piece of stationery worth less than a cent. The restaurant, which only an hour ago had been a symphony of clinking crystal and high-stakes negotiation, had fallen into a vacuum of absolute stillness. The few remaining diners at distant tables seemed to fade into the background, leaving table 14 as the only reality in the room. Choi Sung-min sat perfectly motionless, his gaze fixed on the humble paper napkin that now held the blueprint of his failure. The silence was not the empty kind. It was heavy and pressurized, the sort of silence that occurs when a man's entire world stops spinning on its axis. For months, Choi had been haunted by the noise of 1,000 different opinions. His board of directors had shouted about market volatility, his vice presidents had blamed the engineering teams, and his high-priced consultants had buried him under mountains of jargon-filled reports. He had been drowning in a sea of conflicting data, unable to find the single thread that had unraveled his legacy. Now, looking at Naomi's simple, elegant sketch, the noise in his head simply ceased. The mystery that had threatened to destroy his life's work was stripped of its complexity. It wasn't a global trend or an act of God. It was a series of human mistakes, and they were all his. He looked at the jagged line Naomi had drawn, the one that represented the bridge he had burned. Every red pixel on his tablet, every terrifying headline about his mystery collapse, finally made sense. He realized that while he was chasing the prestige of being a global titan, he had stopped being a builder. He had traded the trust of his earliest believers for the vanity of expansion. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, making the air in his lungs feel thin. He raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting Naomi's. The shock was still there, etched into the lines around his mouth, but something else was beginning to surface. A profound, unsettling respect. He looked at her crisp uniform, the tray she still held with professional poise, and the name tag that identified her simply as Naomi. It was a staggering irony that the answer to a multi-billion-dollar crisis had been sitting in the pocket of a waitress all along. Choi's world had stopped, but in that stillness he was finally seeing clearly. He wasn't looking at a subordinate or a server. He was looking at a strategist whose mind operated on a level his entire board of directors couldn't reach. The silence stretched, long and profound, as the billionaire acknowledged the truth. He had spent a fortune looking for answers in the highest offices in the world, only to find the truth served to him alongside a cup of tea. He opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his life, the powerful executive found himself truly speechless. Choi Sung-min leaned back, the leather of the booth creaking softly as he stared at the napkin that had just dismantled his entire worldview. The silence that had initially felt like shock was now transforming into a heavy, contemplative stillness. He looked at the jagged arrows Naomi had drawn, pointing away from the core and toward the distant, shimmering global expansion star. It was a visual representation of a corporate tragedy, one that had played out in thousands of boardrooms across the world, but it felt agonizingly personal in this quiet restaurant corner. The strategy wasn't just flawed, Mr. Choi, Naomi began, her voice steady and devoid of judgment, echoing the analytical precision she had once honed at the university level. It was a total misalignment of values. When your consultants looked at your European expansion, they saw a gold rush. They saw millions of untapped users and convinced you that your existing product was too niche for a global audience. They encouraged you to shave off the complexities, to simplify the interface, and to focus on the flashy high-level metrics that look good in a quarterly slide deck. She pointed to the thick, heavy line she had drawn that severed the connection between his core user base and the product's soul. But Nexus V wasn't successful because it was simple. It was successful because it was powerful. Your power users, the architects, the data scientists, the engineers who had been with you for a decade, didn't want a streamlined experience. They wanted the granular control that you took away to make the software user-friendly for people who didn't even know your name yet. Choi's eyes followed her finger to the secondary graph she had sketched, the skyrocketing cost of customer acquisition. The reality of his failure was laid bare. He had spent his company's lifeblood trying to buy a new audience that had no loyalty to his brand, while the people who would have defended Nexus V to the death were quietly deleting their accounts. He had traded a loyal community for a fleeting demographic, and the math was devastating. For every new user he gained at an exorbitant price, he was losing 3 veteran users who had cost him nothing to keep. The strategy had gone wrong because it treated customers as data points on a spreadsheet rather than a foundation of a legacy. Choi realized that he had allowed himself to be seduced by the idea of being a global titan, ignoring the very people who had put him on that pedestal in the first place. He had stopped listening to the heartbeat of his company and started listening to the echoes of his own ambition. The silence in the restaurant was no longer a void. It was a classroom, and Naomi, the waitress with the hidden genius, was the only one capable of teaching the billionaire how to find his way back home. Choi Sung-min leaned back into the shadows of the booth, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at the napkin. The silence of the restaurant felt like a heavy weight, pressing against him until he felt he might break. He looked from the simple hand-drawn chart back to Naomi, who stood with her hands folded, waiting with a patience that felt both humble and regal. For the first time in his life, the powerful executive felt a cold, sharp blade of humiliation, not because a waitress had spoken to him, but because of the sheer, undeniable truth she had just uncovered. "My board members," Choi began, his voice barely a whisper, "they are men with decades of experience. They graduated from the finest universities in the world. They have spent millions of my company's capital on proprietary software and global focus groups. And not one of them, not a single one, could explain this." He gestured toward the napkin, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "They spoke to me of unforeseen market shifts and macroeconomic cooling. They gave me 500-page reports that said everything and nothing at the same time." He looked at Naomi, and for a moment the barrier of his status completely dissolved. He wasn't a billionaire tech mogul, and she wasn't a server. They were simply 2 minds looking at a disaster. "How is it," he asked, a note of genuine pain in his voice, That they couldn't see what you saw in 5 minutes. They looked at the same data. They had access to every log, every complaint, and every decimal point. Yet they told me we were doing everything right while the ship was sinking. Naomi met his gaze, her eyes soft with a mixture of pity and professional clarity. They were looking for a way to save their jobs, Mr. Choi. They were looking for a way to tell you what you wanted to hear, that the failure was the world's fault, not yours. They were so focused on the complexity of the data that they forgot the human beings behind the numbers. A board member sees a stagnant user base. I see people who loved a product until it stopped loving them back. Choi felt the reality of her words hit him like a physical blow. He realized that his elite circle had become a hall of mirrors, reflecting only his own ambition and their own fear. They had analyzed his company into the ground, while this woman, standing in the middle of a lunch rush, had simply used her eyes and her heart. The disbelief was staggering. He had traveled the world looking for a savior for his legacy, never imagining that the person who could truly explain his downfall was the one refilling his tea. In that moment, the corporate hierarchy he had spent his life building felt like a house of cards, and Naomi was the only one standing on solid ground. Naomi watched the shock settle into Choi's features, a reflection of the same disorientation she had felt 3 years ago when her own world collapsed. For a moment, the bustling sounds of the Golden Terrace faded, replaced by the ghost of a memory that still tasted like sterile hospital air and damp pavement. She looked down at her hands that were currently stained with the faint scent of oolong tea but had once been poised to sign contracts in glass-walled offices. "I wasn't always invisible, Mr. Choi," she began, her voice soft but carried the weight of a truth long suppressed. She spoke of the life she had been forced to pack away, a life defined by academic honors and a future that felt inevitable. She had been the first in her family to reach for the heights of high finance, driven by a natural gift for seeing the stories hidden within cold data. Her professors had looked at her research papers and seen a visionary. She had looked at the global market and seen a playground. She was weeks away from a recruitment offer that would have changed her family's lineage forever. But life didn't care about market projections or honors theses. The phone call that changed everything hadn't come from a CEO, but from a frantic neighbor. Her mother, the woman who had worked 2 jobs to keep Naomi in school, had collapsed. The diagnosis was a word that sounded like a death sentence. A rare, aggressive illness that required specialized treatment far beyond the reach of their meager savings. Naomi didn't hesitate. She didn't weigh the opportunity cost or calculate the long-term loss of her career. She simply closed her books, withdrew her applications, and flew home. She described the reality of the years that followed, the way dreams are slowly traded for survival. To pay the crushing weight of medical bills that arrived like a relentless tide, she took the first job that offered immediate pay. The Oxford-level strategist became a server, and the brilliant analyst became a shadow. She had learned to smile when she didn't feel like smiling, to apologize for things that weren't her fault, and to walk home every night with aching feet, wondering if anyone even saw her anymore. "I am serving you tea today because my mother needed to live," Naomi said, meeting Choi's eyes with a dignity that transcended her uniform. "I traded my voice for her breath. But being forced to choose between a dream and a family doesn't erase the mind that had the dream in the first place." As she spoke, the invisibility she had worn for 3 years finally shattered. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a woman who had survived a collapse far more personal than a falling stock price. And in her survival, she had found a clarity that no boardroom could ever teach. Choi Sung-min looked down at the napkin, then back at the woman standing before him in the simple black and white uniform of the Golden Terrace. The silence between them had shifted from one of shock to a profound, heavy realization. He looked at his own hands that had signed billion-dollar mergers and directed the labor of thousands, and realized that for all his power he had been wandering in a desert of his own making. The answer to his survival hadn't been in a high-rise office or a Silicon Valley war room. It had been right here, carried on a tray. He reached out and slowly took the napkin, folding it with a reverence that most men reserved for ancient artifacts. He didn't just see a chart. He saw the restoration of his own vision. He looked at Naomi, seeing the exhaustion she tried to hide behind her professional mask, and the brilliance that she had been forced to bury under the weight of someone else's survival. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of guilt for the way he had entered the restaurant, arrogant, blinded by his own misery, and treating the staff as if they were part of the scenery. Naomi, he said, her name sounding heavy and significant in the quiet room. You spoke earlier about trading your voice for your mother's breath. You spoke about a choice that no one should ever have to make. He paused, his gaze intensifying as he leaned forward, the desperation in his eyes replaced by a terrifyingly clear purpose. I have spent the last 6 months surrounded by people who were paid to be brilliant, yet they were only brave enough to be echoes. I don't need another echo. I need the person who saw the bridge I burned while she was refilling my tea. He took a breath, the weight of his legacy hanging in the balance. I am going back to my board of directors tomorrow morning. I am going to tell them that the mystery is solved. But I am not going back alone. He looked at the tray resting on the chair, then back at her. I want you to leave this apron behind. I want you to step back into the world where you belong. Not as a student but as the director of strategic recovery for Nexus V. I will match whatever salary your top recruiters offered you 3 years ago, and I will triple it. Your mother will have the best care in the country, and you will have your voice back. Naomi stood frozen, the words washing over her like a tide she hadn't seen coming. For 3 years she had lived in a world of yes sir and no ma'am, a world where her mind was a secret she kept from herself. The offer was more than a job. It was a resurrection. It was the moment the box under her bed was finally forced open. The restaurant around them seemed to expand, the walls of her invisibility crumbling as she looked at Choi. The choice was no longer about surviving. It was about finally being seen. I'll need a new pen, she whispered, a real smile finally touching her eyes. This one is starting to run out of ink. The heavy oak doors of the Nexus V boardroom swung open with a weight that felt symbolic. For the directors seated around the polished obsidian table, the morning was supposed to be another exercise in damage control, a grim review of the mystery collapse that had wiped out billions in market value. But as Choi Sung-min entered, he wasn't followed by the usual phalanx of stuttering consultants in gray suits. Instead, he walked in beside a woman whose presence commanded a sudden, confused silence. Naomi Grant no longer wore the white apron of the Golden Terrace. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal-toned blazer, her posture reflecting the quiet steel of someone who had spent years preparing for a moment the world tried to deny her. The board members exchanged whispered glances, their brows furrowing at the sight of an unfamiliar face in their most inner sanctum. They had spent millions on global experts, and now their CEO was introducing a stranger to the podium. Choi didn't offer a lengthy preamble. He simply gestured toward the head of the table. Gentlemen, he said, his voice regaining the resonant authority it had lost months ago. You've spent half a year telling me why we are failing. Today, Naomi is going to tell you how we are going to survive. Naomi stepped forward, her hands steady as she connected her device to the central display. The room dimmed, and the jagged, terrifying red lines of their revenue loss illuminated the space. For a fleeting second, the sterile air of the boardroom felt like the hospital corridors of her past, full of crisis and high stakes. But as she looked at the data, the old Oxford-level strategist surged to the surface. She wasn't a shadow anymore. She was the light. She didn't start with complex algorithms or offshore projections. She pulled up the same core metrics she had sketched on a napkin only days prior. You've spent the last 18 months chasing a ghost, Naomi began, her voice clear and rhythmic, cutting through the tension. You prioritized global acquisition over local foundation. You treated your most loyal users as a captured audience, assuming they had nowhere else to go. You were wrong. She swiped the screen, revealing a side-by-side comparison of the simplified global interface versus the original Power User Toolkit. We didn't lose users because of market cooling, she continued, looking the chief operating officer directly in the eye. We lost them because we stopped being the tool they needed to do their jobs. We traded our identity for a trend. As she spoke, the initial skepticism in the room began to dissolve into a profound, unsettled quiet. She laid out a 3-phase recovery plan. A total restoration of legacy features, a transparent apology to their core community, and a pivot of the European strategy to focus on quality over sheer numbers. By the time Naomi reached her final slide, the board members weren't looking at their watches. They were leaning in, seeing the mystery finally solved by a woman who had seen the truth from the other side of a service counter. For the first time in years, Naomi wasn't just being heard, she was being followed. The shift at Nexus V was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, rhythmic pulse that began to beat through the company's digital veins. Under Naomi Grant's direction, the strategy of aggressive, shallow expansion was halted. The flashy billboards in London and Berlin were replaced by a humble, direct campaign that targeted the very people the company had forgotten. It wasn't a marketing blitz. It was a conversation. Naomi insisted that every legacy user who had deleted their account in the last 18 months receive a personal outreach. Not a generic discount code, but a detailed log of the restored features and an honest admission of the burned bridges the company was now rebuilding. Inside the headquarters, the atmosphere transformed from one of panicked damage control to focused, intense craftsmanship. Naomi spent her nights in the engineering bays rather than the executive suites, sitting side by side with the developers who had been forced to simplify the software against their better judgment. Together, they began to re-inject the granular power and complex customization tools that had been the product's original heartbeat. It was grueling work, undoing months of misguided pivots. But as the old code was restored, something remarkable happened. The feedback loops that had been filled with vitriol and silence suddenly flickered back to life. The mystery collapse began to reverse in real time. On the massive monitors in the war room, the jagged red lines of the past year finally leveled out and began a steady, purposeful climb. These weren't the volatile spikes of a new market trend. They were the solid, reliable numbers of returning veterans. The power users, the architects, the data scientists, and the engineers were coming home. They shared screenshots of the restored interface on social media, their skepticism replaced by a cautious, growing loyalty. The captured audience that Choi's previous consultants had dismissed turned out to be the most vocal and effective marketing force the company had ever possessed. Choi Sung-min watched the data from the head of the table, but he no longer felt the crushing weight of impending ruin. He looked at Naomi, who was calmly directing a global server rollout, her eyes reflecting the glow of 100 successful connections. The empire wasn't just being saved, it was being redefined. They were no longer chasing a shimmering, distant star at the expense of the ground beneath them. They were building a fortress on a foundation of trust. By the end of the first month, Nexus V had regained 40% of its lost user base. The stock market, which had treated the company like a sinking ship, began to react to the stability of the recovery. But for Naomi, the true victory wasn't in the stock price. It was in the thousands of thank you messages flooding the support forums. The silence had been broken, and for the first time in 3 years, the voice that was saving the empire was the one that had been invisible for far too long. The light in the executive office overlooking Lake Michigan was different from the harsh, flickering fluorescence of the Golden Terrace kitchen. It was steady, golden, and vast, much like the future Naomi Grant had once thought was lost forever. 3 months had passed since she had last balanced a tray or apologized for a mistake she didn't commit. Now she sat behind a desk of reclaimed wood, her fingers moving across a keyboard with the same precision she had once used to serve tea. The mystery collapse of Nexus V was now a case study in corporate resilience, but for Naomi the true recovery was internal. The salary from her role as Director of Strategic Recovery had done more than just stabilize a company. It had settled the debts that had anchored her to a life of invisibility. Her mother's medical bills, once a suffocating weight like winter snowdrifts, were paid in full. More importantly, her mother was now in remission, receiving the kind of elite care that Naomi had once only dreamed of providing. One afternoon, her mother visited the new office. She walked in on her own, her strength returning a little more with every step. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, looking out at the city that had once swallowed her daughter's dreams, and then at the woman Naomi had become again. Naomi saw her reflection in the glass, no longer a shadow in an apron, but a leader who had reclaimed her voice. "I'm so proud of you," her mother whispered, tears tracing lines of joy down her face. Naomi smiled back, and for the first time in 3 years, it wasn't the practiced, hollow smile of a waitress. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes and warmed her soul. Choi Sung-min still had his empire, but Naomi had gained something far more valuable. She had gotten herself back. She had realized that being invisible was never about her worth, but about the world's inability to see. Now she spent her days ensuring that other invisible talents were recognized, creating scholarship programs for students who were forced to choose between their dreams and their families. She had learned that while life could change your plans, it could never erase the mind that made them. Naomi Grant was no longer just surviving. She was finally, undeniably, seen. The story of Naomi Grant and Choi Sung-min suggests that a person's current social or professional status, such as being an invisible waitress, does not reflect their actual intelligence, capability, or history. Naomi's genius in business analytics remained intact despite her uniform, proving that everyone has a story and potential that may not be immediately visible.